So the title of my presentation is Let's Reinvent the Gods, All the Myths of the Ages, Rewriting the Shadow of Personal Mythology and the Wicked and the Divine. The Wicked and the Divine, or WicDiv as it has become known in fandom, was an Image comic series by writer Kieran Gillen, artist Jamie McKelvey, and colorist Matt Wilson, published beginning in 2014. The basic premise is every 90 years, a group of 12 gods are reincarnated in the bodies of young people. They have tremendous powers, and in 2 years' time, they all die. This cycle of rebirth, death, and return has been going on for centuries, taking place all over the world. And just so you know, there are a lot of spoilers in this presentation. So if you haven't read this, be prepared. In 2014, the gods return. There are always 12. At least that's what they're told. Over the course of the series, we discover that different gods appear in different cycles. The cycle of the return predates many of the mythic pantheons we know, so it makes sense to view the gods as archetypes of power instead of incarnations of specific gods, though they do take on the names. I will be referring to the characters possessed by the energy of the gods as the avatars. This time, the young people who become part of the pantheon use their powers to become rich and famous pop rock stars. Some of them are very obviously influenced by real-life musicians, as this variant cover featuring Lucifer shows. They are not meant to be these specific people. This series plays with the archetypes of rock stars as much as it does the archetypes of myth. Part of the conceit of the series is that these gods, throughout history, have served as inspiration for the arts. On one level, WicDiv is a metaphor about the corrupting power of fame and excess. It's a comic book mashup of superpowers, comparative mythology, rock and roll, sex, and fashion. But there's a lot more going on. We do get to see short stories, one-shots, of some of the previous pantheons. It's an alternate reality, so Gillen plays a little fast and loose with actual historical dates. He really wanted Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, seen here as the avatars of Woden and Lucifer, and the rest of the Romantic poets to be a pantheon, though the dates for the story, 1832, are a little late. In 1923, we see a lot of the lost generation incarnated as gods, and though they are not specifically named, in the text we get F. Scott Fitzgerald, Picasso, and Harold Lloyd, among others, as part of the group. This plays on the idea of divine embodiment, the idea of the word becoming flesh, God or the gods becoming embodied as human. Jesus is the most obvious manifestation of this idea. The idea behind this is that God is present bodily in the world and not symbolic. Communion, where it is believed the bread and wine literally become the body of Christ, is a ritualized repetition of this idea. God returns bodily to everyone who partakes. This is different than the idea of possession, where an outside entity takes control of an existing psyche. The Loa of voodoo are an example of this. The Loa arrive in the ritual space by possessing a person, who is said to be ridden like a horse. In Jungian terms, this is the idea of archetypal possession. For Carl Jung, archetypes could be positive or negative influences. The danger was in identifying too strongly with an archetypal power and letting it unconsciously control your life. I'll come back to this. We're introduced to Ananke. She is immortal and has always been there in each cycle as a warden and caretaker for the gods during their brief incarnation. It is her role to find the new pantheon every cycle and to watch over their development, guiding them in their powers. She is there to welcome them when each of the gods return. From the beginning, it is obvious that she knows far more than she tells them. She warns them that a great darkness threatens all that is, and that what she does to guide them is necessary to keep this darkness at bay. This darkness is the reason for the repetition of the cycle of rebirth. The quote here is from Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, which basically is saying a grand yes to your life, love of your fate. The idea is to live your life in such a way that if you were to relive every moment of it over and over, that you would not change a thing. Ananke embodies this to a certain extent. This is problematic and a trap, as we in the avatars will discover. In WicDiv, the characters lead a normal life until one day a god descends into their psyche. Here we see the origin of Lucifer, or Lucy, as the archetype god enters the consciousness of Eleanor Rigby. Yes, her parents were Beatles fans. This is a sequence we see repeated several times with other characters. When the process is over, we see Eleanor, now transformed into Lucy, kneeling on the scorched ground, surrounded by white feathers, symbolic of her nature as a fallen angel. In The Wicked and the Divine, it becomes apparent that Ananke is not the caring overseer of the gods she at first appears to be. She has a purpose beyond that of the reincarnated gods, and they are expendable if need be to further her goals. Lucy is the first victim of Ananke's plan, though not before she inspired others to rebel. Ananke is the name of the Greek god of necessity, the absolute ruler of all destiny and fate, as it says in the comic. The question this raises is the age-old conflict between fate and free will. Lucifer, by tempting Adam and Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, made them aware of choice, which is absent in the presence of fate. Enlightenment, illumination, self-awareness, however the search for the divine is defined, is awareness of this choice. What the fallen angel offers is the choice of personal responsibility and self-determination instead of blind adherence to the rules and dictates of fate. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, theorized the idea of the eternal return, a different concept than Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. The eternal return is an idea for interpreting religious behavior. It is a belief expressed through ritualized behavior, that by symbolically repeating the events of myth, one is able to become contemporary with or return to the mythical age, the time when the events described in one's myths occurred. He says, in imitating the exemplary acts of a god or of a mythic hero, or simply by recounting their adventures, the man of an archaic society detaches himself from profane time and magically re-enters the great time, the sacred time. He makes a distinction between the sacred and the profane. Profane time is our daily lives, the routine cycle of living. Sacred time is the mythical past, an ineffable expression of the myths that inform our lives. By reenacting these myths, we move closer to experiencing sacred time. Implicit in this is the idea of cyclical time, the idea that certain repeating patterns emerge over the course of human history. In his 2011 book, Supergods, Grant Morrison discussed an idea of generational cycles based on an idea called the Sekhmet hypothesis. Since Sekhmet is one of the avatars in WicDiv, I thought I should at least mention it here. The idea was proposed in 1996 in a book by Ian Spence. He proposes 11-year cycles that was originally based on a scientific idea of cycles of solar flares. This idea was later discredited, and Spence backed away from this part of the hypothesis. He maintained the idea of cycles, which outlined what is essentially a swing between hippie versus punk ideology, which is what Morrison focused on. This idea had already been looked into in far more detail in a different generational theory. In 1991, William Strauss and Neil Howe published Generations, the History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. In it, they analyze American history through the lens of what they define as a generational cycle that repeats roughly every 90 years, the same duration as that of WicDiv. I want to stress that this is meant as an interpretive model of history and human behavior and not a definitive statement about how things really are. They build their case through very specific events and movements. This chart, which I know is hard to read on Zoom, illustrates their generational breakdowns in terms of years. The book has been revised since 1991 to include what we call Generation Z. They used the term millennials in 1991. There's a disruption of their pattern around the American Civil War, which they discuss in great detail, but is outside the scope of this presentation. In the pattern they outline, in each 90-year cycle, there is a crisis, and the way in which individuals deal with it depends greatly on their age at the time, perhaps an obvious observation. In general, they propose that each 90-year cycle is composed of 4 generational cohorts, and that over time there are similarities in each of these cohorts that repeat. The archetypal descriptions they use to describe these are hero, artist, prophet, and nomad. Typically, is the hero cohort that is in early adulthood during the crisis, therefore the generation that must deal with it in the most head-on manner. For example, it is the GI generation who fought directly in World War II. We still refer to them as the greatest generation. They are defined primarily by their heroism. The next cohort in each cycle, the silent generation in this example, are children during the crisis and live in its shadow. The third cohort in each cycle, baby boomers here, is the generation that benefits most directly from the efforts of heroes. The crisis has passed, and historically, so far at least, the world is now a better place. By the time of the fourth cohort, Generation X, which they originally called Generation 13, things are starting to fall apart again, setting up the next crisis event. How predictive is the model? In 1991, they wrote this sentence: "The crisis of 2020 will be a major turning point in American history and an adrenaline-filled moment of trial. At its climax, Americans will feel that the fate of posterity for generations to come hangs in the balance." The avatars are millennials, which according to the Strauss-Hall model is the next generational cohort that will face the crisis. They are the theoretical equivalent of the GI generation. 2 years ago, I did a presentation here on Matt Widener's Mage, the Hero Discovered. In it, I discussed the idea of Jungian archetypes and the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell. Jung's idea of discovering the myth you are living is twofold. It can provide understanding and lead to positive change if one embraces the empowering parts of the story. Jung says it is also possible for the unconscious or an archetype to take complete possession of a man and to determine his fate down to the smallest detail. It can become an excuse for never changing negative behavior. One can become so possessed by an archetype that it is impossible to break free of the negative aspects of the myth you are living. The stories we tell about ourselves can become a cage that prevents genuine personal growth. This is explored in depth in the concept of life scripts and in transactional analysis, developed primarily by psychologist Eric Byrne. According to this, we begin developing a story for our life right from the beginning, based on both conscious and unconscious injunctions we receive from our family of origin. You begin writing it at birth. By the time you were 4 years old, you had decided on the essential details of the plot. As of 7, you had completed your story and all its main details. The Wises were always drunk. She'll never amount to anything. She's gifted. She'll accomplish great things. Messages such as these become the building blocks of the stories we tell ourselves and the myths we begin to live by, either believing and following the messages you receive or by rebelling against them. Either way, you have begun to unconsciously write your own life story. In the story of Wick Div, 6,000 years ago, a group of young people developed incredible supernatural powers. To explain this, they told themselves the story that they were gods. As long as you believe it, it makes you powerful. But their power, as power famously does, began to corrupt them. They were being consumed. One of them decided that this was unacceptable. For her, the god should be immortal. At least she should be. To make sure this happened, she began to tell a new story, one where she could sacrifice the lives of some of the other gods to extend her own life. Her sister, who was the first to manifest power and the one who first told the story of the gods, was opposed to the new story. She saw the trap that the story of immortality could be. Together, they created a third story, one that would set them at odds for millennia. The elder sister would guide each new incarnation of the gods, but before their power burned them out, she would need to ritualistically sacrifice for them to sustain her. She would retain her memory of her life and the story. The younger sister would try to stop her. She would incarnate as one of the gods, the last to appear. She would not remember her past nor her role, though it was she who had the power to end the cycle. At the beginning of the series, our immortal point of view character was Laura Wilson, who began as a normal rock and roll fangirl, dressing like her favorite stars, wishing she too could be a god. She gets that wish by incarnating as Persephone, the last of the 2014 pantheon, the incarnation of the younger sister's god. But the elder also paid a price. She would split into two aspects, the maiden and the crone, both of whom would be active during the time of the avatars. As Ananke, the crone, she would guide the new avatars. As the maiden, she would be reborn and pose as the youngest of the gods, Minerva in this case. The name of this god has certainly changed over the centuries. At the end of the cycle, once the ritual deaths of the four gods occurred, the maiden would kill and merge with the crone and take her place, aging until she became the Ananke of the next cycle. In the narrative, Persephone appears as a surprise 13th god, breaking the rules of the pantheon we thought we knew. However, we discover that since she is an aspect of Ananke, Minerva is not actually one of the 12. The cycle plays out over centuries all over the globe, with little variation in outcome. In most cases, even though she loves and misses her sister, Ananke rightfully sees Persephone as a threat to her immortality and kills her before she comes fully into her power, where she can present a challenge. At least once that we know of, Ananke fails to collect 4 heads to make the sacrifice and complete the story. This, however, does not break the cycle. The result of this is non-existence. When Ananke returns 90 years later as a child, she is terrified of the great darkness. She somehow retains an awareness of the cessation of her story, and this is unthinkable to her. She is, as her sister predicted, trapped by the story, trapped by the myth she is living. When she tells the pantheon they must fight the great darkness, she is referring to her own non-existence. She is telling them that they are expendable as long as she can go on. In 2014, Ananke Minerva has collected the 4 heads necessary for the ritual. Laura, however, has seen the possibility of a new story. She gives up her godhood. She simply stops believing the story that she is the reincarnation of a god. As her belief goes away, so do her powers, so does the story. She is able to convince the surviving avatars to join her in this new tale. One by one, they renounce their godhood and reclaim their true identity. They change their story. They are no longer pawns in a game of life and death that has been played for millennia. With no gods to sacrifice, Ananke cannot complete the story. Though Lucifer needs some convincing, of course. Sometimes the way out of hell, despite what the old stories tell us, is to look back and to help your friends. For the first time in 6,000 years, the cycle is broken. Ananke is dead. The gods will not return. The survivors are able to live their lives, their normal human lives. Unlike their predecessors over the millennia, they are able to write their own stories. As Laura says, after I realized I wasn't a god, all these stories of what I should do fell away. Archetypes, tropes, tradition, all of these, while they can provide a framework for understanding your life, can also be traps. Whether it is our generation, based on Strauss how I'm part of Gen X, which is certainly how I've identified, even though other models make me a boomer, or astrological sign, I'm a Cancer, or what house the sorting hat puts us in, Ravenclaw, or which My Little Pony you are based on a BuzzFeed quiz. Yeah, I'm Twilight Sparkle. We all identify with different stories. Doing so is part of how we form our identities. Part of understanding the myth you are living is recognizing the parts of that myth that are limiting your growth. Becoming aware of your life script is the first step toward changing it. This is true in an individual's life, and it's good advice for creators as well. Joseph Campbell says, breaking out is following your bliss pattern. Quitting the old place, starting your hero journey, even he sees that the real definition of a hero's journey is meant to be individual and not a stable pattern for everyone. The hero's journey is a specifically white European male parable, and while it's a valuable tool for understanding storytelling, it is also not the only story that can be told. Strict adherence to it, or any of these models, can also be a block to creating a new narrative. After all, to quote Kieran Gillen, the writer-creator of The Wicked and Divine, archetypes are just cliches with a PhD. To close, Laura says it best. All those books of destiny, those stories telling you the way it's going to be, they just conceal the truth beneath it all. Look past the words. Remember they were written. Remember they are a writer's design, not yours. Every story tries to bury what the future really is beneath all that ink, but it's up to you. It's always been up to you, because the future is a blank page. The end.
Hello, my name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav. And like many of you, I read funny books for a living. And today I've come to talk to you about a little known and obscure aspect of 20th century pop culture, the superhero. What if I stopped right there? Wouldn't it be great if my entire presentation had just assumed that everyone listening had no idea what superheroes were? And early on, when I first envisioned this talk, I sort of considered writing the paper that way, just as a challenge. But while I was doing it, I quickly bored myself. So it's not going to happen. But last year at PCA, I called myself a postmodern, post-structuralist. And by last year, I mean 2 years ago, because time has no meaning in a pandemic, as we've all learned. And so, see, that's postmodernism right there. I'm like demonstrating as I talk. But when I said that, I started thinking about what does postmodern mean when you're studying the superhero. We use ages when we talk about things, golden, silver, bronze, modern. And I thought, what does it mean to be the postmodern superhero? Does the concept of superhero have meaning at all anymore? And what happens if we analyze the genre of superheroes without privileging it with our preconceived notions of what a superhero already is, and assuming that it has value beyond what it does? So I started thinking about that. And spoiler alert, you end up with a lot of nothing. The concept of superheroes, as popular as it may seem they are right now, don't actually exist anymore. And frankly, I don't think they have in a long time. Superheroes are a relic. The genre, I'd say, is about as obsolete as the printed newspaper in which superheroes once appeared. They have the same cultural significance as a rotary telephone or a cathode ray tube television or a fax machine. It is the spiritual influence of modern entertainment, but in its purest sense, it's little more than an inefficient and dated curiosity collected by hipsters. At best, the superhero is a vinyl record. At worst, it's an 8-track tape. In either case, the idea of the superhero makes as much sense as wearing underwear on the outside of your clothing. And actually, it makes less sense because people actually do wear underwear on the outside of their clothing now. But when they do, they look nothing like the way that we've been drawing it for the last 80 years. And by the way, like trying to find celebrity men who wear underwear on the outside of their clothing is basically limited to Prince and Larry Blackman. So, we should do better. But anyway, when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, superheroes were a popular but weird niche genre of fiction. They were aspirational, wherein remarkable beings of unimaginable power set forth to use their gifts to defend universal greater ideals, spread didactic messaging. Superheroes represented truth, justice, the American way, and with that, with great power comes great responsibility. What power? The power of Grayskull. I imagine. I don't actually know, and knowing is half the battle. Also, Spoon, which doesn't really fit as well, but I like the tick. So, um, anyway, yes, He-Man, She-Ra, and GI Joe I included in there because in the Saturday morning cartoons that I watched as a kid, the distinction between what was a superhero and wasn't was kind of blurry. Of course, Saturday morning cartoons don't really exist anymore either. But that doesn't really answer the question. What were they? If I'm right and superheroes are a thing of the past, then there must have been some cohesive point in the past where superheroes were a cohesive thing. Much superhero scholarship has focused on the definition of superheroes as a genre. Prescriptive definitions have been offered by the likes of creators like Kurt Busiek, critics like Peter Coogan, and every fan who has spent way too long in a comic book shop on a Wednesday afternoon. These taxonomies are always structural and formal. Whatever taxonomy you follow, you are in effect assuming a platonic ideal of a superhero. You are accepting superhero-ness as semiotics. The term becomes a signifier that mimetically recalls a base formula of supernatural power, a unique costume, an odd code name, secret identity, unflinching ideology, and other tropes. In effect, a superhero assumes classical de Saussurian structuralism, multiple binary oppositions. The superhero and supervillain define each other, but jointly as a class, they are defined by the ways in which they are not normal. However, like many structural arguments, superhero genre taxonomies lend themselves to edge case arguments. Are Black Widow and Batman superheroes even without superpowers? Do Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and John Constantine count despite their lack of code names or costumes? What about questionably moral anti-heroes? Deadpool, Venom, Punisher, Harley Quinn. And why do we count some costume archers as superheroes but not others? A formal structuralist view of superheroes implies that all of these questions are easily answered. But spending more than 30 consecutive minutes in the comic book store, again, any Wednesday in America, will show you that it's not. But if we consider the superhero as a post-structuralist phenomenon, this might not matter at all. Much contemporary superhero scholarship views the superhero as a myth. Umberto Eco, noted structuralist post-structuralist or post-structuralist structuralist, who's to say, gives an academic framework for analysis to the superhero myth as an independent literary form. Eco posits that Superman, and with him all other superheroes, must be viewed as mythic figures because of their presumptive perpetual publication model. He argues that the superhero narrative was the never-ending second act of a three-act structure. Superheroes were governed by the illusion of change. The narrative requires that all mythic heroes, like all mythic heroes, the superhero faces a succession of Herculean tasks, representing allegorical threats to the society that birthed him. However, in order to continue the series ad infinitum, the superhero is never allowed to enter the third phase of a Campbellian hero's journey. The particulars of the superhero journey don't matter to Eco. Instead, post-structural superheroicism is more concerned with how superheroic narratives must function in order to become myth. However, a key flaw or feature, depending on your point of view, is that Eco's framework provides no template for what a superhero might look like, only that the superheroic journey be unbounded, except they're not. Many of the most notable superhero texts since Eco's essay have specifically been written as bounded and consumable narratives, often with the express purpose of so-called genre deconstruction, with the primary goal of challenging what the superhero narrative could even be. Series like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns are postmodern in any number of ways, cynical rather than aspirational, reflective rather than didactic, breaking narrative conventions and norms. In the interest of time, I'm going to just presume that if you are in this panel at this conference, you need no other explanation. You know what Watchmen is. It changed everything. Let's move on. In any case, as the 20th century closed, superheroes moved towards darker, edgier representations in the wake of Watchmen and its ilk. Comics also turned postmodern in a literary sense. Narrative complexity, structural experimentation, intertextuality, ideological complexity, and all-out cynicism as this became increasingly as comics became increasingly more tied with capitalist structures that ran the industry. This also coincided with a gradual and complete a gradual but complete and total decoupling of the concept of superhero from any real sort of context. In the mid 1980s, texts like Watchmen argued that none of the classic tropes of superherodom could be taken for granted. Then, by the 21st century, the tropes had lost any semantic values as signifiers at all. The superhero lost its meaning and we just didn't notice. Or if we did, we actively ignored it. The clearest example I can think of here is Smallville. Released in 2001, the series was famous for its no tights, no flights rule. The show, in effect, removed every recognizable aspect of the Superman character. If something like Watchmen deconstructs the superhero, then Smallville tears it down to its frame. A television show about Superman, wherein he would never use the name Superman. He would never fly. He would never wear the costume. Few would argue that Smallville is not a superhero show. However, where I would argue, and in fact, I did argue in Adapting Superman essays in Transmedia Man of Steel, in the Transmedia Man of Steel, in stores now, and you're welcome for the cheap plug, John. I argued that by turning Smallville into essentially Dawson's Creek, Smallville posited that while the existence of the superhuman did not alleviate problems inherent with Smallville posited that the existence of the superhuman did not alleviate problems inherent with the human. For the postmodern superhero, the superhuman world recedes into the background so that the superhero narrative can focus on the human story. In Smallville, whatever meteor freak Clark has to fight this week is irrelevant. The real question is, how does a 16-year-old boy control premature ejaculation? And yes, that is the actual plot to the season 2 episode Heat. What Smallville in effect does is take that basic mythic gestalt that is that it can assume every reader has for the concept of Superman as a universal cultural touchstone that requires no further explanation, and then extends the mythos from there. Lois and Clark does the same thing. Lois and Clark is Superman, but it's soap opera. Red Sun, the comic, is Superman, but he's a Soviet. Smallville is Superman, but it's a coming-of-age teen drama. No one, and this extends beyond even the comics directly based on Superman. Invincible, Superman, but he's a bad guy. Brightburn, Superman, but he's a horror villain. No one ever refers to Smallville as it's Dawson Creek, but with superpowers, even though that is just as correct and quite possibly a more accurate descriptor of the concept. The CW's descendants of shows like Smallville include the Arrowverse, but also shows like Riverdale, Nancy Drew, Kung Fu, The Vampire Diaries, The 100, The New Charmed, The Old Charmed. Which ones are superheroes is not immediately clear. The answer could easily be all of them or none of them if you are unaware of their status as a DC Comics property. However, many fans would also be surprised to learn that Lucifer and iZombie share their genesis in the DC universe as well. Beyond that, they all are simply heroic people in an action-based narrative. Even the clearly superhero-based media of today pay only token tribute to the traditional tropes of the superhero identity out of kind of a historic inertia. The MCU's Captain America illogically wears a mask despite having an entirely public identity throughout his entire narrative. Wonder Woman maintains a secret identity despite having no friends, no loved ones, or personal life. Tony Stark incongruously refers to Spider-Man as Underoos, a nickname that can only be a metatextual reference, as it is impossible for it to have any diegetic meaning within the narrative of Captain America Civil War. The notable postmodern exceptions in more modern narratives that maintain structural superhero-ness, such as The Boys and Invincible, are typically over-exaggerated in order to parody and deconstruct a genre that largely doesn't exist anymore. The post-structuralist view is also abandoned. The most popular portrayals of so-called superheroes over the last decade have been the MCU films. They are defined almost entirely by status quo shakeups in a way that is contrary to the traditional history of the genre. Avengers Endgame fundamentally and irrevocably restructured the entire line status quo in the first 15 minutes of the movie. WandaVision is a story about grief and mental trauma. Falcon and Winter Soldier is the story of men dealing with two men dealing with systemic racism and PTSD. Even within the traditional comic book realm, the stories that have been the biggest stories have been non-traditional stories of family separation, mental illness, divorce, personal trauma. The superhero is more concerned today with exploring the quotidian than the extraordinary. What makes Mr. Miracle interesting is that despite his physical gifts, his life is ultimately mundane, and that mundanity is the key to the loss of the superhero genre. It isn't that superheroes don't exist anymore. Certainly they do. It's just that in the year 2021, they're indistinguishable from any other protagonist. Without a cape or funny underwear as a defining structural trope, without mythic inconsumability as a defining post-structural technique, the concept of superheroes as a genre that can be postmodernly deconstructed is quickly becoming nonsensical. What was the superhero is simply now the hero. It's just how we tell stories. Anything beyond that is just nostalgic hipster wankery with little purpose beyond abstract arguments at academic conferences and comic book shops. It's buying your music on vinyl. But what I'm saying is Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man sounds really amazing on vinyl, and you should really check it out. Thank you.